Two black twins sat quietly at a bar when a group of police officers approached them, unaware that one was a decorated captain and the other a highly respected special operations commander. "Hey, you two," one officer said, his tone firm but controlled. "It might be better if you leave before this situation goes any further." Officer Brett Coleman's voice carried over the low country music playing in the background as he and two colleagues positioned themselves near the twins' table. It was a Friday night at Danny's Tavern, a spot known for being popular with off-duty officers. The dim lighting did little to hide the uneasy tension slowly filling the room. The tension in the room continued to rise. Daniel and David Thompson, 34-year-old twins, had barely taken a sip of their drinks when the three officers stopped at their table. "Is there an issue, officer?" Daniel asked calmly, his eyes still resting on the bottle in front of him. His body language was unusually relaxed for someone being confronted. It was subtle, but it stood out. Brett didn't seem to notice, but his partner, Officer Rick Torres, caught it immediately, his expression tightening just slightly. "The issue," Brett replied, placing his hands on the table and leaning in, "is that this place isn't exactly meant for people who don't fit in. The kind of place for people like you. We're just trying to keep things calm," Brett added. David, seated beside his brother, finally lifted his head. His gaze met Brett's with an unsettling calm. There was no fear in his eyes, only the quiet patience of someone who had experienced moments like this before. "Trouble," David said evenly. "We're just sitting here, having a quiet drink." The third officer, Jake Morrison, the youngest of the group and clearly not as steady as the others, let out a sharp laugh. "You really don't get it," he said. "This place is mostly ours, and we don't take kindly to people who seem out of place hanging around." A few patrons quietly glanced over, but most kept their eyes forward, pretending nothing was happening. It was the kind of moment sensible people chose not to get involved in. Three off-duty officers stood facing two men who it seemed had drawn attention simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel briefly met David's eyes. It lasted less than a second. Yet in that silent exchange an entire conversation unfolded. Years of shared experiences passed between them, moments they had faced together since adolescence, learning side by side how to stay composed, how to read a room, and when silence was stronger than words, when to stand firm and when to step back wisely. What Brett Coleman didn't realize, and couldn't have guessed, was that the brief silence wasn't surrender. It was evaluation. Daniel was calmly taking in the scene, noting small details most people would overlook. Brett's stance, Rick's tense posture, his attention fixed on the situation even while off-duty. Jake's unsteady balance, suggesting he wasn't as clear-headed as he should have been. Beside him, David was already aware of their surroundings, quietly noticing the presence of the establishment security staff and the general layout of the room. Cameras positioned around the room gauged the distance to the nearest exit and noticed the bar's owner, Louise, watching from behind the counter with visible concern. "Look, we don't want any issues," Daniel said at last, his voice still carrying that calm, steady tone that somehow made the situation feel even more tense. "We'll finish up and head out. No scene. No." Brett's response was sharp. He struck the table with his hand, causing the bottle to rattle slightly. "You're leaving now," he said firmly, leaning in, "and you're going to appreciate that I'm giving you that option." Being in a good mood today. For a brief moment, Daniel's thoughts drifted elsewhere. He was 15 again. He and David were walking home from school when officers stopped them without explanation. "Where did you get those backpacks?" one of them had asked, as if two students carrying school bags needed to justify themselves. That day, they had kept their heads down and complied, the quiet humiliation settling deep inside them, but they weren't teenagers anymore. "You know," David said calmly, reaching into his pocket and slowly pulling out his wallet. "We really are just trying to enjoy a peaceful evening." Pocket, in a deliberately slow, non-threatening motion. "It might help if we all confirmed who we are," David said evenly. "Just a simple check, nothing more." Brett's face tightened, a hint of color rising to his cheeks. "Are you questioning me?" he snapped. Rick Torres immediately placed a hand on Brett's shoulder. "Hey, let it go," he said quietly. "They said they're heading out." There was something about the twins' behavior that unsettled him, a calm that didn't come from fear, but from quiet confidence. It set off an instinctive warning in the back of his mind. Jake, however, was clearly not picking up on any of it. His judgment was dulled, and he leaned forward with a careless smirk. "You know what? What's your problem?" Jake said, his finger wavering slightly as he pointed toward David. "You think you can just show up here and we run this place? You get that?" he added, voice rising. "This place?" Daniel repeated, his tone calm but with a new, sharp edge. "Interesting that you'd put it that way." Brett leaned forward and nudged Daniel's shoulder. "Time to go." The bar fell silent. Even the music seemed to fade into the background. Luis, behind the counter, dropped the glass he had been drying and quietly reached for his phone. Daniel and David exchanged a quick glance, alert but still composed. David stood up at the exact same moment as his brother. Their movements were perfectly in sync, almost rehearsed. Same height, same solid build, something their casual shirts didn't fully conceal. "We're leaving," Daniel said evenly, "but the way this was handled won't be forgotten." Brett let out a loud, dismissive laugh. "Oh, really?" he said. "We'll see how confident you are once we step outside and sort this out properly." He leaned closer. "I'm sure questions will come up." David met his stare without blinking. "You really don't know who you're speaking to, do you?" David asked softly, his voice calm. "It wasn't a threat, more like quiet observation," Jake scoffed, trying to sound intimidating. "Here, you don't mean much." The twins began walking toward the door, Brett and the other officers trailing behind. Rick Torres felt a shiver run down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the brothers moved, not hurried, not anxious, but with the quiet precision of people who were fully aware of their surroundings and in control of themselves. As they reached the door, Daniel paused and... Daniel turned slowly. "One last chance to step back and clear the air before we leave," he said calmly. Brett straightened, bracing himself. "Or what?" he asked. Daniel's lips curved slightly, not in anger or defiance, but in a way that conveyed quiet control. "Patience. The patience of someone who already has the situation fully assessed before taking any action." "Or nothing," he said evenly. "Just thought it was fair to give a heads up." At that moment, the door opened, and the twins stepped out into the dimly lit parking lot. Inside the bar, no one, least of all Brett Coleman, could have anticipated what came next. No one could have guessed that the next 15 minutes would change everything. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens when overconfidence meets real consequences, make sure to subscribe to the channel. What's about to unfold in the parking lot will show that appearances can be deceiving, and that some secrets, when revealed, can turn lives upside down in moments. The parking lot outside Danny's Tavern was nearly empty, with only a few cars parked under the dim lights. The parking lot was lit by flickering street lights. Brett Coleman shoved Daniel back against the hood of a parked car, the cold metal pressing into his shoulders. "You know what the issue is?" Brett said harshly, his breath carrying the scent of alcohol. "You think you can walk into places like this and act like you belong." Jake Morrison moved unsteadily around David, his steps uneven. "I know your type," he muttered with a bitter laugh. "Always hiding something." He shook his head. "We're going to check you. Properly." Rick Torres stood a few steps back, watching with growing unease. Something about the situation felt wrong. His posture stiffened, his attention fixed on the scene, as if his instincts were warning him that this was about to go somewhere it shouldn't. Rick Torres's hand stayed near his side, even though he wasn't on duty. Something about the twins triggered a warning inside him, but the alcohol and peer pressure kept him from fully listening to it. Daniel stayed perfectly still against the hood, but his eyes never stopped moving, taking in distances, angles, and every detail of the surroundings. It was a habit he had developed long ago, in high-pressure situations where even a small misstep could have serious consequences. Memories flashed briefly. Years earlier, he had learned how to stay calm under extreme pressure, observing everything around him before making any move. Experiences like that had shaped the way he handled tense situations now. Daniel's mind briefly flicked back to intense, high-pressure moments from his past, situations where every second mattered. He had learned to stay calm, observe carefully, and make split-second decisions without panicking. "Hey," Brett said sharply, trying to snap Daniel out of his calm demeanor. "Be careful with your words," David said softly, still motionless. His voice carried the same quiet intensity as before. "Some things, once said, can't be taken back." Jake moved forward, shoving slightly, trying to provoke a reaction. Or what? You going to complain to someone? He laughed, spreading his arms in mockery. We're the police, Brett said sharply, trying to assert control. He reached toward Daniel's pockets, his movements forceful. Let's see what's here, he muttered, patting down quickly. Wallet. Phone. He tossed the items on the ground. That's a fancy phone for someone who might have borrowed it, he added with a bitter laugh. Give that back, Daniel said calmly. But it wasn't a request. It was a quiet command, the kind that carried an unspoken authority and expected immediate compliance. Brett noticed the tone, and his irritation only grew. Or what exactly are you going to do? Brett started to demand, his voice sharp. Daniel's mind briefly flicked back to another high-pressure situation, years earlier at a naval training base. Commander David Thompson had been leading a highly disciplined team, emphasizing that real strength comes from knowing when to act and when to wait. Jake tried to push forward, his unsteady movements betraying his impaired state. Stop right there, he barked, though there was uncertainty in his tone. David assessed the situation calmly, his composure and awareness clearly giving him the upper hand. Even under pressure, he remained fully in control, ready to respond appropriately if needed. David stood even taller, relaxed yet commanding. His presence alone was enough to unsettle Jake. Do you realize how your actions over the last 10 minutes might be crossing boundaries? David asked calmly. Harassment, aggressive behavior, unlawful handling of others' belongings, all things that shouldn't happen. Brett laughed. Oh, so now we're getting a law lesson from the guy on the sidewalk? Rick finally stepped in, his voice tense. Brett, man, that's enough. They're leaving. Let it go. Brett spun toward him, face flushed with anger, clearly struggling to contain his frustration. Since when did you get cautious, Torres? These guys could use a lesson in respect, Brett muttered under his breath. Across the parking lot, Luis watched from the bar window, quietly recording with his phone. He'd seen similar situations unfold many times before, Brett and his colleagues targeting people they assumed wouldn't stand up for themselves. But this time was different. The twins weren't afraid. They remained patient, composed, and fully aware of everything around them. Jake, however, seemed to misread their calm for weakness. You know what I think? He said, stepping forward slightly, testing the situation. I think you guys came here looking for trouble, Jake said, his confidence growing. Looks to me like you wanted attention. He tapped David lightly on the chest, trying to provoke a reaction. People like you always do. Daniel and David exchanged another quick glance, barely half a second. But in that instant, a full understanding passed between them. It was the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from years of working side by side under pressure, knowing exactly what the other was thinking without a word being said. Brett reached toward his belt and pulled out restraints. You know what, he said, forcing a grin. I think we're going to sort this out at the station. Your behavior's raising concerns. The air in the parking lot felt heavier now, as if everyone present sensed that the situation was reaching a point where there was no turning back. Resisting authority, Brett muttered. That's what this looks like. Daniel slowly turned to face him fully. We haven't resisted anything, he said evenly. The pause that followed made the words linger longer than they should have. For a split second, Daniel's thoughts drifted to another time. A moment years earlier when he and David had first worked side by side under extreme pressure. Back then, Daniel had shared a lesson that stayed with them both. Fear isn't something you eliminate, it's something you manage. You stay calm, let others underestimate you, and wait for the right moment to respond. Jake staggered again, his movements becoming less controlled by the second. You really don't understand how this works, he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. The tension in the parking lot felt stretched thin now, as if everyone sensed that the situation was approaching a critical turning point. You don't understand how things work around here, Jake said, sweeping his arm across the lot. This is our city, our area, and you're just passing through. Passing through? David replied quietly, his tone calm but cutting. Is that the word you meant to use? Jake's face flushed. I meant you're becoming a problem. Brett snapped the restraints open with a sharp click. Hands behind your back. Now. No, Daniel said simply. The parking lot went completely still. 3 full seconds passed without a sound. Even Brett seemed momentarily caught off guard, blinking as if he hadn't expected to hear that answer. Something had shifted. Brett stared at him, clearly unsure he'd heard correctly. "What did you just say?" "I said no," Daniel replied calmly, folding his arms. "We haven't broken any laws and we're not agreeing to restraints." He held Brett's gaze. "And if this situation keeps escalating, it won't end well for anyone." The confidence in his tone froze Brett for a moment. People didn't speak to him like that. Not usually, and not without consequences. "Are you warning me?" Brett snapped, his voice rising. "Did you just issue a warning to an officer?" "No," David said quietly, stepping in before things could spiral further. "He's explaining boundaries." The words landed heavier than a threat ever could. "A warning," David finished calmly. "There's a difference." Rick took a step back, his instincts finally overriding everything else. "Guys, seriously, something's off here. Let's stop and walk away." But Brett was already flushed with anger, his authority feeling openly challenged. "No," he snapped. "They need to learn today." He lifted his radio. "I'm calling for backup. We'll handle this properly." "Properly?" Daniel let out a short laugh, empty of humor. "You don't actually know what that looks like." Jake moved suddenly, reaching for David's arm, trying to regain control of the moment. But David shifted smoothly, turning his body just enough to break contact without force, his movement calm, controlled, and effortless. The parking lot froze again. Rick's unease deepened. This wasn't going the way Brett thought it was, not even close. Jake's hand grasped at nothing but air. The movement had been so smooth, so controlled, it almost looked unintentional. Almost. Rick saw it clearly, and his stomach tightened. He'd seen that kind of precision before. Training, not instinct, not luck. "Brett," Rick said urgently, "stop, right now. Enough, Torres," Brett snapped back. Behind them, the bar's lights flicked off as Luis began closing for the night. The parking lot grew quieter, darker. In minutes, what was unfolding there would reshape the lives of everyone involved. Daniel glanced down at his watch, a rugged, understated timepiece, recognizable only to those who knew exactly what they were looking at. He looked back up calmly. "You really should have listened," he said evenly. And for the first time that night, the balance of power was unmistakably clear. "You have exactly 1 minute to step back, clear this up, and walk away," Daniel said evenly. Brett laughed right in his face. "Or what?" "Or you'll learn," David replied calmly, "that there are serious consequences when authority is abused, especially against people you shouldn't have underestimated." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Brett's expression shifted as he processed what he'd just heard. "People you shouldn't have underestimated?" he repeated. "What exactly are you saying?" Before he could press further, Jake, emboldened by arrogance and poor judgment, made a reckless move. He reached toward his side, convinced force would finally put him back in control. Rick's heart dropped. "This is bad," he muttered under his breath. "Enough talk," Jake muttered, stepping forward. And that was the moment everything shifted. What the 3 officers didn't realize was that the next 30 seconds would be recorded, shared, and examined by thousands. Footage that would raise serious questions, not just about that night, but about patterns of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Because Daniel and David Thompson weren't just ordinary men who happened to be calm under pressure. They were individuals shaped by years of intense training, discipline, and responsibility. Trained to stay composed, to protect themselves legally, and to respond only when absolutely necessary. They hadn't been waiting to fight. They had been waiting for accountability. And when the situation crossed a line, everything that followed unfolded within the boundaries of self-defense, clarity, and undeniable evidence. By the time backup arrived, the story was no longer about control. It was about consequences. The moment had arrived where everything would be clearly documented. Jake swung recklessly, but missed completely, his own momentum causing him to stumble forward. David didn't need to react dramatically. A slight, calm step aside was enough. The precision of his movement spoke more about control than aggression. Before Brett or Rick could fully comprehend the situation, Daniel pulled out his phone. Calmly, he began recording the incident. "This is unprovoked behavior," he said steadily. "Armed officers acting outside of their authority. Please observe carefully." The parking lot was silent. the tension now fully captured on camera. Every misstep, every overreach, every reaction was being recorded. A clear, undeniable record of what had transpired. Daniel held the phone steadily to the camera. Unprovoked, aggressive behavior against civilians being recorded for accountability, he said. Brett stepped forward, trying to grab the phone, but Daniel smoothly kept his distance, careful yet calm. Interesting, David remarked, pulling out his own phone. Now we have two officers trying to interfere with private property while behaving inappropriately. Rick Torres finally realized what was happening. His instincts screamed that this wasn't an ordinary situation. These weren't ordinary people in the parking lot. The twins' composure, awareness, and calculated calm showed that they were fully in control, even under extreme provocation. The tension in the parking lot had shifted. Brett and Jake were no longer dictating the pace. Everything was now being documented, and the outcome was clearly tilting toward accountability. They noticed the way the brothers moved, how they coordinated without saying a word, how their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, maintaining complete situational awareness. It was clear now. These men had a military background, and not just regular service. This level of discipline suggested special operations. Brett, Rick said urgently, gripping his colleague's arm. Stop. Now. Brett yanked his arm free. Why? He snapped. They're recording? Good. Let the whole world see how we handle people who refuse to cooperate. That was the moment the situation truly shifted. Luis stepped out through the back door of the bar, his phone raised, recording everything from a clear angle. I've already got this on video, he said loudly. From the beginning, the air in the parking lot changed instantly. What had started as intimidation was now turning into documented accountability, with multiple witnesses and cameras capturing every move. I've already called the county sheriff, Luis announced loudly. And I've sent the videos to 3 local newspapers. You're fired, Louise, Brett growled, trying to assert authority, and your bar, it won't happen. A female voice cut through the night. A black woman in a sharp suit stepped out of a car parked in the shadows. Every inch of her posture radiated authority and control. Because I am Assistant District Attorney Lisa Monroe, she said firmly, and I just witnessed 3 officers commit multiple documented offenses tonight. Brett's face went pale, the color draining as the weight of her words sank in. For the first time all evening, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The twins stood calmly, Daniel still holding his phone, David keeping an observant eye on every move. The situation that had started as intimidation now ended with undeniable accountability. All fully recorded, all fully documented, and all completely in their favor. Lisa approached calmly, holding her badge openly. Harassment, intimidation, attempted assault, misuse of authority, misconduct. She counted each clearly on her fingers. Shall I continue? They started it, Jake stammered, pointing at the twins. They provoked us at the bar. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Really? Because the videos I've received show all 3 of you initiating the confrontation and continuing even after multiple warnings. David put away his phone and crossed his arms, standing tall and composed. Daniel kept his phone in hand, ready to provide additional recordings if necessary. The air was tense, but now the power clearly rested with accountability. Every misstep, every overreach, and every moment of arrogance by the officers had been documented, leaving no room for dispute. The parking lot was silent. The situation that began as intimidation had ended decisively, with truth, evidence, and the law firmly on the side of those who had remained calm, observant, and composed under pressure. David crossed his arms, a subtle, confident smile playing on his lips. Prosecutor Monroe, he said quietly, long time no see. Lisa Monroe nodded, recognition clear in her eyes. She then looked at Daniel. Captain Thompson, she acknowledged. The silence over the parking lot was absolute. Rick closed his eyes, finally grasping the gravity of the situation. Brett blinked several times, his judgment clouded by a mixture of rage and disbelief. Jake simply froze, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. Wait, what? Brett finally muttered, struggling to articulate the reality before him. Daniel stepped forward, his posture subtly shifting, calm, controlled, and authoritative. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The twins weren't just ordinary civilians. Their identity, discipline, and professionalism were now undeniable to everyone present. The parking lot no longer felt like a confrontation zone. It had become a stage for accountability. Daniel exuded the calm of someone who avoids unnecessary confrontation, yet carried the unmistakable authority of a highly trained leader. Captain Daniel Thompson, he announced quietly, United States Army, Ranger Battalion, currently an instructor at West Point. David stepped forward, equally composed. Commander David Thompson, he said. Navy SEALs, Team 6. On leave after 3 tours overseas, reality hit Brett like a tidal wave. He had harassed, intimidated, and attempted to assert authority over 2 of the country's most highly trained military officers, on camera in front of witnesses and fully documented. The weight of the evidence, the undeniable authority of the twins, and the presence of Assistant District Attorney Monroe left no room for excuses. The confrontation that had begun as arrogance and intimidation ended with accountability, transparency, and complete clarity about who was truly in control. Brett tried to reclaim some sense of control, but his voice wavered. You still haven't identified yourselves as... We are not required to identify ourselves to civilians, Daniel said calmly, his tone now carrying undeniable authority. Especially not while being subjected to harassment and unsafe behavior. Rick took a step back, raising his hands. Look, there's clearly been a misunderstanding. We can all move past this, forget it happened. Lisa's voice cut through sharply like glass. 3 officers acting outside their bounds. Documented, recorded, and witnessed. This isn't something that can be ignored. The parking lot fell silent. Everyone understood now. Accountability had replaced intimidation. The twins' composure, backed by evidence and legal authority, had decisively shifted the power in their favor. Arrogance and poor judgment had brought them here. Brett, Jake, and Rick had harassed 2 decorated military officers, attempted to assert authority improperly, and behaved recklessly. Jake's forehead glistened with sweat. We didn't know they were military, he stammered. So, it would have been okay if they were ordinary civilians? David tilted his head slowly. Is that what you're implying? He asked. That mistreating people is acceptable as long as they don't have training, experience, or authority? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Brett tried to find a last word, to regain any control, but it was clear. The evidence, the witnesses, and the presence of Assistant District Attorney Monroe left no room for escape. Accountability had arrived. The parking lot had shifted from confrontation to resolution. The twins' calm, their composure, and the undeniable documentation had turned arrogance into consequence. Proof of anything? Brett muttered, trying to sound confident. It's your word against ours, 3 officers versus 2 civilians. Daniel smiled. Not friendly, but calm and measured. Prosecutor, he asked quietly, how many videos do you have so far? 4 different angles, Lisa replied, consulting her tablet. Louise started recording while you were still inside the bar. The Thompson brothers have footage from the parking lot, and I have the last 8 minutes fully documented, David added casually, raising his wrist. And our watch's record, too. He showed a sleek, military-grade device, audio and video perfectly synced. The combined evidence left no ambiguity. The arrogance, harassment, and improper actions of the officers had all been captured. Accountability wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The parking lot was silent, the balance of power fully shifted, and everyone present understood that the situation had been decisively resolved in favor of truth, law, and documented evidence. This is standard security protocol whenever we're in civilian areas, Daniel said evenly, his calm authority unmistakable. Brett staggered slightly, caught off guard by the weight of the words and the undeniable evidence. Lisa continued, swiping through her tablet. I already have 3 witnesses from the bar willing to testify, and the establishment's security cameras are operational, all footage intact. Rick sank down onto the curb, burying his face in his hands. He knew the situation was over, not just for this night, but potentially for their careers, reputations, and the lives they thought were secure. What do you want? Brett asked finally, his voice small and uncertain. Daniel smiled faintly. We want accountability, truth, and for people to understand the consequences of actions like yours. The parking lot was silent. The tension dissolved into clarity. Justice had been documented, witnessed, and captured, and there was no denying it. Brett's tone wavered, shifting from aggressive to desperate. Money? We can pay. Apologies? I'll apologize right now. What we want, Daniel said slowly, deliberately, is justice. Not just for us, But for all the others you've mistreated over the years. Lisa nodded. Because I would bet my career that you three have a pattern. How many people have you harassed, Brett? How many improper detentions? How many lives impacted because you believed you were above the law? Jake's shoulders shook, tears streaking down his face as the reality of accountability hit. The parking lot was quiet, the weight of truth and evidence pressing down. The twins, calm and composed, had turned arrogance into accountability. Justice was not just a concept that night. It had been documented, witnessed, and undeniably enacted. Brett's face was red with panic. My career, my family will kill me, he muttered. You should have thought about that before, David replied without a hint of sympathy. Before deciding you had the right to intimidate people just because they looked different from you. A sheriff's patrol car pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. 2 deputies stepped out. Rick recognized one, a veteran officer who had never tolerated Brett's behavior. Prosecutor Monroe greeted the deputies. We received your call. Are these the individuals you need to speak with? The weight of the situation was clear. The harassment, intimidation, and improper actions had been documented, witnessed, and fully accounted for. This confrontation was over. Justice had arrived. The deputies confirmed the charges. 3 counts of harassment, attempted improper use of authority, abuse of position, and conduct unbecoming a public official. And that was just the start. As Rick, Brett, and Jake were escorted into the patrol car, handcuffed and subdued, the irony was unmistakable. Brett turned to the twins one last time, genuine confusion on his face. How did you plan this?" he asked. Daniel exchanged a brief, silent glance with David. No words needed, just understanding. Then he looked back at Brett. "We didn't plan anything," he said calmly. "We just stayed composed, documented everything, and let accountability take its course." The parking lot had transformed from a scene of intimidation into a lesson in calm authority, evidence, and justice. The twins' composure had turned arrogance into consequence, and everyone present, from witnesses to law enforcement, saw it clearly. "You did it all yourselves," Daniel said calmly. "We just made sure it was documented." As the 3 officers were guided into the patrol cars, Luis stepped forward. "Thank you," he said simply. "These men have been doing this for years. No one ever had the courage to hold them accountable." "How many?" David asked gently. "How many other people?" Luis thought for a moment. "Dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. Always the same pattern. Anyone they considered different." Daniel nodded slowly, a quiet understanding passing through him. Something had shifted that night. Not just in the parking lot, but in the way accountability and courage could intersect. For the twins, justice hadn't been about retaliation. It had been about standing firm, documenting truth, and letting the system and evidence do its work. Daniel's expression remained calm, reflective. What had started as self-defense had quickly grown into something larger, a lesson in accountability and courage. Lisa put away her tablet. "You two are free to go. I'll need formal statements tomorrow, but for today," she paused. "Is there anything else you want to share about these 3? The brothers exchanged a glance. That silent, unspoken communication only twins who had faced war zones together could share. "Maybe," Daniel said finally. "But first, we need to make a few calls." At that moment, Brett's phone buzzed, a reminder that the consequences of their actions were only beginning to unfold. The parking lot was quiet now, the tension replaced by clarity. Justice had been served, accountability had been documented, and the story was far from over. But tonight, the right side had prevailed. Rick's phone buzzed. Then Jake's notifications exploded simultaneously. "What?" Brett muttered, unlocking his screen. His face drained of color. The video had gone viral. #CorruptCopsExposed had already garnered 2.3 million views in just 3 hours. Every angle was captured. The harassment at the bar, the inappropriate behavior in the parking lot, the improper attempts to assert authority, and worst of all for them, their faces, names, and badge numbers were visible in every frame. "My God," Jake whispered from the patrol car, realizing the magnitude of the consequences unfolding in real time. Immense and messages were flooding in. Public outrage, calls for accountability, and praise for the twins' composure and courage. What started as a routine night had transformed into a historic lesson in accountability, documentation, and the power of staying calm under pressure, bar. The response was relentless. Messages poured in, identifying additional incidents and victims. The police department was being flooded with calls. Daniel watched the updates on Lisa's tablet, his expression calm, neutral. 17 victims have already come forward, she reported, all with similar stories, some with supporting evidence. Brett tried to speak from the patrol car. "We can fix this." "I'll shut you up," the deputy sheriff interrupted firmly. "You three are suspended without pay while a federal investigation is opened. Brett, your record will be reviewed. Every report, every arrest, every action from the past several years is under scrutiny." The weight of accountability was immediate and unmistakable. What had begun as harassment and intimidation had now triggered systemic consequences. Justice was no longer just a personal matter. It had become official, documented, and unstoppable. Rick sat silently, tears welling in his eyes. His wife had already seen the viral video and filed for divorce. The mortgage, his son's college tuition, everything had relied on the salary he'd just lost. David crossed his arms, calm and measured. "You had multiple chances to stop. Every warning ignored, every opportunity wasted." At that moment, the deputy sheriff approached Captain Thompson. "Pentagon has called," he said. "They want your reports for possible additional military review regarding any officer who has interacted with active duty personnel." The magnitude of the situation was staggering. 8 years of unchecked behavior, combined with public exposure and federal scrutiny, had led to consequences far beyond what anyone in that parking lot could have imagined. Accountability was complete, systematic, and fully documented. Brett was sick inside the patrol car. By morning, 7 national news outlets had covered the story. By afternoon, the mayor announced a full departmental overhaul. By evening, the 3 former officers were facing a combined 23 criminal charges. Luis had reopened the bar. Now there was a line out the door. Everyone wanted to visit the place where corrupt officers had finally been held accountable. Daniel and David watched the coverage from their hotel room. Notifications kept popping up. 18 calls from the Pentagon alone. "They want us," Daniel commented, his tone calm but alert. Reports, statements, additional insight on protocol misconduct and systemic reform. For the twins, justice had been clear, decisive, and complete. They hadn't sought fame or revenge, only accountability, and the world had witnessed it all. Daniel and David received calls to testify about proper procedures, along with 3 invitations to speak publicly on combating misconduct and police abuse. David glanced at the online comments. Previous victims expressed relief. Justice had been slow, but now it was real. At the back of the police station, Brett stared at the cell wall, realization sinking in. Everything was gone. Career, respect, future. Why? Because he had underestimated 2 men solely based on their skin color. The irony was unmistakable. The system he had manipulated for years now held him accountable with unflinching precision, and as millions watched the viral videos, the message was clear: abuse of authority, harassment, and discrimination have consequences. And sometimes, justice arrives in the most undeniable way. The downfall was complete, and one truth resonated: arrogance always takes its toll. Always. 6 months later, Brett Coleman served coffee at a roadside diner. Sentenced to 3 years of probation, he had lost everything: badge, pension, home, family. Jake sold insurance over the phone, his voice trembling every time he had to give his name. Rick worked as a night security guard at a supermarket, avoiding mirrors and memories of the past. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. 17 officers had been suspended, reassigned, or disciplined. Accountability had arrived, not just in the heat of that night, but in the system itself. Justice had been thorough, public, and inescapable. A reminder that no one is above the law. The twins, Daniel and David Thompson, had returned to their lives with calm assurance, their actions demonstrating that courage, documentation, and composure could change even entrenched systems. The cases were thoroughly reviewed. 43 incidents were investigated. 8 victims were exonerated and received financial compensation. Daniel Thompson was promoted to major, now directing ethics and accountability training programs for police forces across 6 states. "Respect is not demanded," he explained in crowded lectures. "It is earned." David Thompson accepted a consulting role at the Pentagon, focusing on military-civilian relations. His photo appeared on the cover of Time magazine, the commander who reshaped the national conversation on accountability and misconduct. Luis expanded his bar to 3 locations, becoming a hub of community pride and resilience. The place where courage, calm, and documentation had turned a night of intimidation into a historic lesson in justice. The legacy of that night, and the actions of 2 calm, courageous brothers, continued to influence lives, institutions, and conversations nationwide. Justice, when done right, has ripple effects far beyond a single moment. Luis now trained bartenders nationwide on how to document and report abuses of authority. Silent witnesses are accomplices became a national slogan. Lisa Monroe was elected chief district attorney with 73% of the vote, becoming the first black woman to hold the position. On his last day of probation, Brett watched Daniel on TV. "Hate doesn't define who we are," the major said during the interview. "It defines who we choose not to be." Brett turned off the TV, the weight of irony heavy on him. He had enjoyed every privilege, every assumed advantage, and yet it had all been undone by courage, accountability, and the refusal of 2 men to stay silent in the face of injustice. The story of that night, and the actions of the Thompson twins continued to resonate nationwide, proof that justice, calm composure, and proper documentation can change lives, communities, and institutions. Brett had his badge and his gun system. The Thompson brothers had only their dignity, and yet they won, because in the end, arrogance always loses to competence, prejudice always falls before character. Those who judge others by appearances discover too late that they misjudge the right people. The best revenge is never to destroy enemies. It's to build something so significant that they are too small to affect it. Daniel and David proved it. Brett learned it too late. Justice has no color. It has consequences, and sometimes all it takes is courage, patience, and integrity to ensure that accountability is inevitable. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, because when dignity meets opportunity, even the most powerful are reminded of humility, the hard way. Witness courage, accountability, and the undeniable lesson that integrity always wins.